The Iranians do not need rockets. They do not need drones. The Iranian people need to live happily.
The Iran war. Talks of a possible deal are intensifying, but is one actually close? Is Washington bluffing or preparing for another round of war? Because Israel's military says it remains on its highest level of alert, and Tehran is warning that if conflict resumes, it won't stay confined to the region. But can Iran really widen the war? Joining us to break it all down is Hazem Alghabra, former senior advisor at the US State Department.
The Iranian regime is between a rock and a hard place. Now, they won't admit it. They're not going to tell you that, but they are.
Then, the Strait of Hormuz. For decades, it has been viewed as one of the world's most important oil choke points. But now Iran appears to be trying to turn it into something else entirely, a permanent geopolitical toll booth. According to a new Bloomberg report, Tehran is now in talks with Oman over formalizing a toll system for ships transiting the strait, potentially institutionalizing Iran's control over one of the world's most critical waterways. And it's not just oil. Iran is also threatening to install some sort of permit systems and so-called protection fees tied to undersea internet cables, infrastructure that powers the global digital economy. So where does China fit into all of this? And how much leverage does Tehran really have? Max Meizlish of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and former US Treasury official focused on sanctions enforcement joins us with a deeply unreported angle.
If the United States really wanted to, it could bring a lot of pressure there by threatening to cut off all dollar access to Hong Kong as an entire jurisdiction.
And later, a report alleging Israel once explored installing Holocaust denier Mahmoud Ahmadinejad after eliminating Ali Khamenei. Stranger than fiction? Or a sign of how chaotic the calculations around Iran have become? We'll discuss with Hayvi Bouzo. She is the co-founder of Middle East 24 and national security expert Shayan Samii.
He is somebody who was actually one of the most kind of viciously aggressive Iranian presidents.
Could he have given the coordinates about Ali Khamenei's whereabouts? Who knows?
I'm Negar Mojtahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Deal or no deal? War or no war? As the world watches apparent moves towards negotiations, but then, military assets continue pouring into the region, Trump says Iran sits on the border between war and diplomacy. Tehran says it's ready for expanding the war beyond the region. So what's real? What's posturing? What's going on here? Joining us now is Hazem Alghabra, former senior advisor at the U.S. State Department.
Thank you.
Trump, Netanyahu, and Erdogan are speaking. IRGC commander Ahmad Vahidi is meeting with Pakistani officials. The Saudis, the Chinese, and regional actors are allegedly pushing to avoid escalation. At the same time, Tehran, as we said, says they're prepared for more war. Trump says they're somewhere in between all of this. So I understand we don't have a crystal ball. We can't predict the outcomes, but based on Trump's negotiating style and his belief in pressure tactics and even the art of the deal, how do you see this playing out? Hazem, we can start with you.
I'll try to make it quick. So this week, we're likely not going to see any escalation. It's the Holy Week, pilgrimage. It's a special time for the Middle East and the Muslim community at large. And there was lobbying by the Gulf leadership that was very clear, and Trump mentioned it. The ceasefire will hold at least for this week.
Is it because of the Holy Week, do you think? Or
a big part of
is
it
it just
is such, yes. But also, I like to look past the tweets and the Truth Social postings and look at the war as a very technical thing. War is a bunch of operations and objectives. Right now, the objectives are being met without any kinetic action, without any hostilities. The Iranian economy is collapsing quickly. The oil aspect is a very important aspect. I mean, this is the Iranian government derives 80% of its revenue from oil, to our understanding, and a huge portion of that goes through the Hormuz Straits. When the Iranian regime decided to exercise their version of terrorism on the Straits and block international shipping, that opened the opportunity for the U.S. to retaliate with the same. For the international community, for the US, for other countries, the Hormuz Straits is one of the lungs for international trade. For the Iranian regime, it's the only lung. There's no way to export mass amount of oil outside of Iran without the Hormuz Straits. So now the Iranian regime is between a rock and a hard place. Now they won't admit it. They're not going to tell you that, but they are. The biggest problem we're facing right now, the biggest obstacle, is something that President Trump mentioned quite a few times, and it continues to be a problem. Who makes the decision in Iran today? We have what it's called the reformists. They're not reformists. They're the civilian administration. They're hardly reformists. You have the traditional religious, the theocracy, and you have the IRGC. It looks like the IRGC is holding most of the cards right now. But there seems to be some kind of friction, struggle, disagreement between these factions. However, what does that mean? Can we reach a deal? And can any deal being reached right now or next week or whenever be sustainable while some forces continue to fight among each other within the regime itself? These are important questions because we're not looking for a deal that will last a week or 2 weeks. Nobody wants to revisit this tragedy next year or the year after. What we're looking for in the US and in the Gulf right now is, and of course, most importantly to me, the Iranian people need something sustainable, something that creates a pathway to a better future. And I'll wrap with one last point. A lot of people have been asking me, will there be a deal that is only nuclear? Potential. I would say a good nuclear deal will end the war. However, it will not lift sanctions. And that is the biggest problem for the Iranian regime right now. So for the sanctions to be lifted, all 4 points, what used to be 3, now 4 points, covering the nuclear, rockets and drones, support for transnational terrorism, and now the Hormuz Strait needs to be addressed in a lasting agreement. Thank you.
So are you saying that the kinetic action could stop, but the economic won't, and ultimately it's the economic warfare that's going to bring this regime down?
There may be some limited operations, naval operations. The Iranian regime has been using these like tiny boats, fast boats, fishing boats, to terrorize and harass ships. So that would be that's easy to attack mainly, and that's still not a war. It's within the counterterrorism aspect of the operation. Assassinations of figures may be important if U.S. intelligence see a reason to kind of prod in a certain direction toward the deal. There are individuals that are obstacles in the way of a deal right now. Not the way we're seeing it, it's individuals, not establishments. These individuals represent an establishment, but these individuals remain the key obstacle, and they're a lot easier to address than the whole establishment, if you know what I'm saying.
And also, does this not seem a little bit like a broken record? Every week we hear, I'm going to attack, now I'm not going to attack, and we're talking to Pakistani officials, now we're not, and people are growing impatient. So just to conclude with you, Hazem, I mean, you worked with the Trump administration in the previous Trump administration. What are your thoughts on that? Does this match Trump's behavior? And how much longer, realistically, can we go on between this, I guess, so-called limbo between diplomacy and confrontation?
No, you cannot compare the situation to any other past situation. We've never seen this, especially with only the Europeans. What is propping the Iranian regime right now is two things: Russian and Chinese complicity and European complacency. One of the two, if these two legs, one of those collapse, things will be fantastic. We did not, and again, we have to separate, and the Europeans said something really silly. They're like, oh, we don't want to be part of the war. The war ended after around 24 hours when the Iranian Air Force was destroyed, where their leaderships were killed, where the air defenses were gone. Then the Iranian regime moved to terrorism. Now, Every country has an obligation, in my opinion, and I think, the free world has an obligation to combat terrorism. When the Iranian regime is lobbing unguided missiles and drones onto neighboring countries, attacking merchant ships like pirates, that creates an obligation that the Europeans did not meet. Hopefully that will change soon. But I want to conclude with a simple question. And because one of the things that really bother me is trying to finding a middle ground. There's really no middle ground here. What is being asked of the Iranian regime is good for the Iranian people as much as it is good for everybody else. The Iranian people do not need weapon-grade uranium. The Iranian people do not need Hezbollah or the Houthis or whomever other terrorist organization and crazy fanatics taking their hard-earned money and spending it on killing other people. That's definitely not what the Iranians want. The Iranians do not need rockets. They do not need drones. The Iranian people need to live happily. And again, I was just in Dubai and I met a few Iranians and they said, we wish we can live the way people live in Riyadh or Dubai, safe and happy, and be able to prosper and raise a family without concerns over our personal safety from the regime itself or from wars that this Iranian regime keeps inviting. So again, it would take seconds to reach a deal that will not change anything for Iran. It will not make Iran less in any way. However, it will bring peace and prosperity to the Iranian people and the rest of the region. Especially if we remember that probably 99% of the problems in the region over the past 50 years can be traced directly or indirectly to this Iranian regime. So what is being asked is not extreme in any way. Nobody's asking the Iranian regime to bend over backward. Nobody's asking for territory. Now, mind you, I think the UAE, or Sharjah technically back then, but the United Arab Emirates should get their islands back. The Iranian regime owes the UAE 3 islands. We have to remember that. So actually that may be a base for operations for a future, operation to secure the straits and hold Iran accountable for any violations of whatever agreement we reach. But there needs to be a stick and a carrot moving forward if this regime is to survive. And finally, I really hope that the Iranian people will find this time to be opportune to move against the regime. Because I think this may be a very rare chance, and the next opportunity may take another half century, a time that nobody has. So this may be the best time for the Iranian people to take matters into their own hands and affect tangible change in their country.
Thank you so much, Sheeb, for the incredibly thoughtful conversation today.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz and China's role. To dig deeper into that, we are joined by Max Meizlish with the FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He is also a former US Treasury official focused on sanctions enforcement and licensing. Thank you so much, Max, for being here.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. So when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, this is, I would say, pretty underreported. So I'd love to explore this with you. Where does China fit into all of this?
So what we know is just at the highest level with respect to the conflict involving Iran is that there's really no more important enabler to Iranian malign influence and Iranian sanctions evasion than China. I'm sure that many of your listeners are already familiar with this, but the fact is that China has long purchased about 90% of Iran's exported oil supply, which means that Chinese purchases of that oil is directly supporting the IRGC, the hardline elements of the Iranian regime, all of those entities that are paying for the ballistic missiles and the attacks on the United States military bases, Israel, on Gulf infrastructure, all of that is funded and backed by China. So with respect to the Strait of Hormuz, we've known that for some time now, there have been discussions between the Iranians and the Chinese to secure passage of Chinese vessels. Early on in this conflict, when Iran was effectively taking control over the strait, we saw plenty of vessels actually labeling on their transponders, their AIS transponders, Chinese crew, Chinese owned, as though that was some sort of signal that they would have safe passage. And we have seen some level of passage of Chinese crude and Chinese owned vessels. But still, there are some firms that have actually been prevented from leaving, as there have been a lot of uh, tumult, let's just say, and volatility in the actual administration of the Tehran toll booth. So right now we have seen some developments where Iran is formalizing some of that control. I would expect to see more Chinese ships having safe passage through the Tehran toll booth, going through the Tehran controlled lanes within the Strait of Hormuz. But right now, it's just a little bit too early to say what those volumes will look like and if the Chinese may face any problems in the strait.
And so, what about sanctions enforcement when it comes to the United States if the Chinese do go through with this?
So the United States has clarified that any payments to Tehran in the form of a toll directly to the Iranian regime or to relief agencies or supposed charities that payments might be going to would be prohibited because they would be directly or indirectly benefiting the government of Iran and the IRGC. I think it would actually be a good thing if the U.S. specifically clarified that the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, which is this system that the Iranians have announced is going to be responsible for administering tolls in the strait. I think it would be good if the U.S. actually specifically designated that entity and made it clear that any payments directly or indirectly to them, whether through traditional currency or cryptocurrency or any other means of payment, would be prohibited for the purposes of U.S. sanctions. Um, I just don't know if we'll end up seeing this. I mean, the United States has not really applied all the pressure it could bring to bear against Chinese entities that have enabled Iranian sanctions evasion over the years.
Why?
So maybe, well, there's a lot that Iran could do to retaliate against the United States if we applied more aggressive economic statecraft. There are ways in which Iran might retaliate and cut off the flow of certain sensitive rare earth minerals that are vital
Mhm.
for defense goods, commercial goods. China has a major monopoly over the mining, extraction, refining, and processing of those minerals. But here's the reality, right? I think that the United States actually has a very much of a competitive edge over China in this regard. China's banking sector is quite fractured. It's quite vulnerable to economic coercion. What we know is that there is a lot of bad debt on the books of Chinese banks. We know that China, from a macroeconomic perspective, is suffering due to high youth unemployment. We know that the housing crisis has been a persistent challenge for the Chinese. I mean, so when I look at this, sure, we would have to accept that there's some level of response from the Chinese that we would not want to tolerate. We wouldn't want to experience. But from where I sit, the Chinese are actually very vulnerable to U.S. economic coercion, and it's telling that around the same time that the U.S. sanctioned a Chinese teapot refinery recently, there were warnings from the Chinese financial regulator telling banks in China to not extend new loans to those refineries. And this was coming at the same time that the Chinese had invoked their anti-sanctions statute for the first time, prohibiting firms from actually complying with the terms of U.S. sanctions. So on the one
Mm,
hand, there was a
it's a
part of
big
the
deal.
Chinese government that was telling firms to defy U.S. sanctions. But on the other side, we see within the financial regulator space, right, the regulators who are actually responsible for stability in the banking sector, making sure that Chinese house of cards doesn't collapse. They're the ones going in and saying to banks in China, hey, don't extend new loans to these sanctioned entities because we can't risk you being sanctioned as a result, because that would create a lot of risk in the Chinese banking sector. So to me, all of that supports the idea that the US actually could bring a lot more pressure to bear right now because China is uniquely vulnerable to economic coercion.
Is that kind of the next steps in all of this, do you think?
I think if the United States wanted to be more aggressive and go after the third-party enablers who support Iranian sanctions evasion at scale, there would be no country more important to go after than China, specifically the banks in Hong Kong that have been responsible for years for moving billions of dollars in sanctions evading financial flows. We also know, frankly, that there's a lot of money that's moved through the UAE. I think that the United States might find a bit more receptive audience in the Emirates, where there seems to be some new cooperation between the Israelis and the UAE, some cooperation between the U.S. government and the UAE. But it's just not clear to me exactly whether we will actually see the level of cooperation that we would need to have, billions of dollars in accounts being frozen. Another
Mm,
jurisdiction where the U.S. could apply pressure is with respect to Turkey. And so
yes.
we know that there's a lot of money that flows through Turkish exchange houses, Turkish banks. We have seen some pressure from the United States going after these firms, but I just don't think there's going to be. Um, uh, it doesn't seem like there's a political will, at least at the moment, for the U.S. to actually go ahead and sanction the banks responsible, or, in my view, take what would be an even more meaningful step and utilize a very under-discussed tool, which is Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act, which effectively allows the United States, at its most severe application, to cut off dollar access to banks in foreign jurisdictions by requiring U.S. banks not provide correspondent banking services to them. And so when we think about Chinese sanctions evasion benefiting Iran, a lot of that money goes through Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is a global financial hub, right? It's not just important to Iranian sanctions evasion, it's a hub for moving tens of billions, trillions of dollars globally around the world, and it relies on access to dollars to do that. So if the United States really wanted to, it could bring a lot of pressure there by threatening to cut off all dollar access to Hong Kong as an entire jurisdiction. But right now, I just don't think that we have the political will to actually take those steps.
So speaking of political will, I mean, when I'm hearing this from you, I mean, this sounds like a pretty brilliant way of not only leading to the demise of the Iranian regime, but to also weaken this anti-Western access, if you will. So so why not? Especially because if you don't want to take kinetic action right now necessarily, this would seem like a really good way to do it. I mean, what kind of retaliation do they fear?
So there's a lot of steps that the Chinese could take, like I said, with respect to the critical minerals. So that's one. There's also, thousands of firms that operate in China. They could be subject to harassment by the Chinese government. There could even be detentions, right? What we would see is an instance where the Chinese would invoke their anti-sanctions statute. They would make it illegal for any firm operating in China to actually comply with the terms of U.S. sanctions. And so that would put these firms in a really difficult position. In my view, I think that this is still worth the cost there, right? We have to recognize we're fighting a war here. And so we shouldn't just be willing to accept, potential battlefield losses, but not accept any economic loss. We need to apply that same logic there and recognize that we're in the middle of a war. We're in the middle of potentially a once in a lifetime
Yeah.
opportunity to fully degrade the Iranian regime's capacity to exert its influence in the region, threaten U.S. and allied interests. And so that's going to come with a cost. The Chinese are going to put up a fight there if we actually applied that logic. I mean, here's the reality, right? When President Trump left the summit with President Xi from China, um, both countries were speaking very similarly, right? They both were talking the language of quote unquote strategic stability. In my view, this is an error for the United States to actually subscribe to this notion of a period of strategic stability, because from the Chinese perspective, what that means, they're trying to define stability as lack of accountability, right? They're trying to
Mm,
create a condition where any attempt by the United States to actually hold China accountable for its malign influence and its enabling of Iranian sanctions evasion as instability. Any
yeah.
attempt by the United States to hold China accountable will inherently be seen in Beijing as quote unquote destabilizing the relationship. So it's an error for the United States and for the White House, for President Trump to be talking about this notion of strategic stability with China when we just know that on all of these areas of competition, there's no more important country to tackle than China, and there are all these unique economic vulnerabilities that I described that we should be taking advantage of. And so, hopefully, through discussions like these and through other people people writing in influential means of news media and op-eds, discourse, that can begin to permeate through the culture. We can start to accept that there's a need to have a greater political will and to accept some of the economic cost of utilizing these tools to their maximal effect. Because the reality here is, for all the talk of maximum pressure has been a really effective bumper sticker. And I think we need to move from the period of bumper stickers into the period of behavior change. The only way to do that is by actually utilizing these tools to their maximum effect.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, this window or, this historic window really is only going to last for so long. And when it comes to this toll booth, there was a Bloomberg report alleging that the Omanis and the Iranians are in talks to formalize the system. And when I hear, formalize, that tells me that there's already moves in place, that it's already happening in an, not a formal way. So what do you know of that and where does China fit?
So we know that there have been some discussions between the Iranians and the Omanis. We just don't know the extent to which those conversations have actually solidified anything in terms of permanent engagement between the two governments to have effective control and tolling over the Strait of Hormuz. We also really don't know the extent to which China has been involved in any of those discussions, but we know that China, among other governments, for instance, Vietnam, South Korea, I believe Greece also has been in this, where there have been bilateral discussions from government to government, from those governments and the Iranians to secure passage through the strait. It's hard to imagine that none of that will involve some sort of discrete financial payments if Iran really is trying to implement this toll booth, shaking down transit through the strait. And so it's a worrying sign when we see that the Omanis might be open to participating in that as being the partner on the other side of the strait from Iran. Um, in my view, I think that this exposes the Omanis to a great deal of sanctions risk from the United States if they are seen as providing some level of material support to the Iranian regime for this toll booth system, for the toll payments, for the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. Um, but we just don't know. What we do know is that for quite some time now, there have been plenty of trading houses operating in Oman. There have been hawaladars that have been supporting the Iranian regime, supporting illicit financial flows, benefiting the regime and its network of sanctions evasion operators. So if Oman takes a step forward and actually solidifies control over the strait in partnership with Iran, I think that what we're likely to see is a lot more aggressive economic statecraft aimed at them, because the same measures that I'm talking about could be applied against Beijing are the same that could be applied against firms in Oman, right? The United States could cut off dollar access for banks in Oman if they took this step. They could sanction them, out of existence, essentially, right? If these firms lose access to the dollar for certain ones that are need that access for vital commercial trade, cross-border currency exchange. I mean, it could be a death sentence for some of these firms. So it would be telling if they took that step, right? Because that would mean
Yeah.
that they actually value cooperation with Iran and the stranglehold over the strait more than they actually care about having commercial engagement and providing for the people.
And what about Beijing? Would they back something like this or would they not dare?
So China has come out and said that they are in favor of the strait being returning back to normal. Right. We know that of all the countries in the world, it's China that is most exposed to the strait being shut down effectively, and for there to be a slow trickle of energy leaving the strait, because China is the manufacturer to the world. Right. It's the world's largest manufacturer. It's the world's largest importer of energy. A huge volume of Chinese imported energy comes from the Gulf in terms of LNG supplies and crude. Um, China is hurting here. And the reality is that China is hurting not just for the sake of its own energy inputs that it relies on getting from the Gulf, but because its trading partners in the region are also hurting, right? So China is actually providing the market with additional supply right now. So interestingly, China is backfilling a lot of the supply shock that is being experienced in that part of the world, because China is concerned that its trading partners in Asia might fall into a recession if they don't have the necessary jet fuel and diesel to keep the commercial engines going. And so if those countries have a macroeconomic shock, then that means that China won't be able to export to them, and their entire model relies on that. So that's, in my view, the reason why China is largely in favor of restoring freedom of navigation in the strait, because it's uniquely vulnerable in a way that no other country really is to disruptions in the strait.
And what about China participating in bilateral payment discussions? And why is that so significant, Max?
Again, it just creates another risk for China in terms of sanctions enforcement. Look, the risk is only there if the U.S. chooses to enforce against it, right? There's perceived risk, and so some firms might say, "Well, we don't want to deal with these Chinese entities that might be engaged in facilitating payments to Iran and benefiting the Iranian regime." But there are plenty that will, right? Because the way that compliance works, it's all risk based, and if there's a lack of enforcement, then firms will naturally think that the risk of enforcement is low, and so the United States needs to step up its posture there. The test of that will be if the United States takes action against a firm in mainland China or in Hong Kong, maybe a Section 311 action. There's a lot the U.S. can do to hold the Chinese accountable, but it's just not clear that the political will really is there. And I think that China will do what it needs to do to secure the flow of ships that are coming to China. Right, we have to remember that China is going to be singularly focused on what's good for itself, and so if it can strike a deal while other firms or while other countries are stuck behind Iran's blockade line, then it will do that. But at the end of the day, China is going to want for there to be freedom of navigation there because it has a lot to lose by keeping the strait closed.
And Iranian officials are reportedly saying that ships may need to coordinate through a newly called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, with some vessels allegedly facing payment requests of up to 2 million for safe passage. How extraordinary is that claim? And are we kind of witnessing the early stages of a much larger economic confrontation here?
Well, it would amount to billions of dollars every year, right? If we have hundreds of ships going through the strait, and if we have $2 million, I mean, who's to say what the ultimate fee would be? Maybe the fee would depend on the cargo. Maybe would it be only for liquefied petroleum gas, liquefied natural gas, crude oil? Who's to say right now? There's really no incentive for anyone to publicize the terms of payment for the rents that Iran is trying to extract because it would drive attention from the U.S. government and create new sanctions exposure for those firms that are actually paying into the system. I think over time we will get a lot more transparency there. There's been good reporting from Lloyd's List, which is a maritime news publication, detailing what kind of information the Persian Gulf Strait Authority is actually requesting of ships. They want to know information about the insurance, who the ownership, the management companies, all this sort of information because they want to see if there's any ties to Israel or to the U.S. or to the UAE, countries that Iran is currently fighting. I just don't think that we'll see this take off in any meaningful way because, when you look at Secretary of State Rubio saying, it's a non-starter, right, to have no freedom of navigation in the strait. I think that's good, and we need to build on that
Yeah.
because, like I said, China doesn't have an incentive for the strait to be closed off. It'll cut a deal if it needs to cut a deal, but what it wants is an open strait. So does the United States, so do the Gulf partners. Creating more stability there is good for the world. It's only not good for Iran. And so anyone who's supporting this newfound structure for Iran to extract rents in the strait, all they're doing is just supporting the Iranian regime. It's not supporting any notion of stability in the world.
Well, thank you so much, Max, for enlightening us. That was a really important discussion.
Of course, thank you.
Well, Ahmadinejad, Mossad, and the New York Times. A New York Times report is triggering shockwaves across the world. It alleges that Israel once considered a scenario involving former Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who is, of course, known to be a Holocaust denier, to take over after the elimination of Ali Khamenei. The plan, according to the report, was obviously never carried out, but even the allegation has ignited fierce backlash, and it seems, what can I say, stranger than fiction. To talk about this, joining us now is National Security Advisor Shayan Samii and Hayvi Bouzo, the co-founder and editor of the Middle East 24. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here.
Pleasure to be with you.
For having us, Negar.
Wonderful. So, Shayan, for our viewers, let's start with you. For people who may be unfamiliar with who Ahmadinejad is as a character, give us a brief overview of who he is and why he's so controversial.
Mahmoud Ahmadinejad started as the governor general of a western province in Ardabil. And then he, lo and behold, became the mayor of Tehran out of nowhere. And then again, out of nowhere, he defeated a former president, Rafsanjani, who wanted to make a political comeback for the presidency, and Ahmadinejad became president. Then in 2009, for his re-election, it ignited the Green movement because they literally, not that other times they hadn't cheated for elections, but this time they cheated enormously and overwhelmingly. And Ahmadinejad was declared the winner. I'm not going to say he was re-elected because he was not. He was declared the winner by the system. And then Ali Khamenei, in a Friday prayer sermon, distinctly stated that the election is over, the results have been submitted and verified, and for everybody's attention, Mr. President's viewpoints are closer to mine than any other candidate, which basically meant everybody shut up. Decision is made, Ahmadinejad is my boy. And Ahmadinejad is a controversial figure because during his administration, not only the parity rate of the foreign exchanges exorbitantly went up, he actually introduced a plan called low income or low cost housing. It was intended to create more affordable housing, but it became such troublesome, and there was a lot of corruption in it that people were actually forced to leave such projects midpoint. And then he also had a few oil rigs, quote unquote, stolen in his administration. How do you steal an oil rig? Ahmadinejad knows how to do it. And then his closest alliance with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela created another layer of Ahmadinejad going way to the left and attaching himself to leftist groups and trying to create a sense of populism among the Iranian nation. Some people believed in him because he also said, we're going to eliminate subsidies and we're going to give cash subsidies to people for their well-being. But that was never enough. Prices went exorbitantly high. Inflation was out of control. And so his term ended in a lot of debacles. But right after he left office, he became entangled with Khamenei and the leadership apparatus. Why? Because a lot of his minions were jailed, including his vice president, who was jailed for corruption. So there is no love lost between Ahmadinejad and the IRGC, who is technically and realistically running the show. So now, this is the overview of Ahmadinejad. If you want me to go into the New York Times, I can, or we'll come back.
Well, no, thank you for that overview, just to give people a sense of who he is, why he's so controversial. I mean, lest we forget that he also said there was no gay people in Iran. He denied the Holocaust, said he would wipe Israel off the map. There was the very public killing that was televised on social media and was played on media outlets across the world of the killing of Neda al-Sultan, who was just an innocent bystander, actually. Yeah. She wasn't even really taking part in the protests during the 2009 Green Movement, all under his watch. And now he tries to frame himself as some sort of opposition leader, if you will. It's quite it's shameful. Have we heard from him lately? Is my question.
No. And this is the other perspective, that he was technically assigned to stay home. He had a couple of bodyguards who were supposedly taking care of him, but it was widely and openly believed that he was under house arrest or under surveillance. Why? Because they didn't want, the government and the system did not want him to come out and speak at public squares, because he loved to just open the door to his house and start talking to any bystander who would pass by. And he wanted to recreate an image of a populist person to combat the so-called elitists in the Islamic regime's system.
Yeah. And despite that apparent house arrest, he was also traveling in 2024 and 25 to Hungary, where he was meeting with the then prime minister, which is also very unusual. So Hayvi, given your background in the media and the Middle East, how do you view how this has been covered, and do you buy this story?
Look, Negar, it's really interesting, right? Because there are those, speculations that this is probably because Trump was happy with the Venezuela kind of execution of how things happened, and that he would like to reapply this to Iran. Now, the truth is that it doesn't apply to Iran. And Ahmadinejad is somebody like just Shayan mentioned, and you mentioned, Negar, is that he is a fierce enemy of the West. He hates the United States. He wants to wipe out Israel from the map. He is somebody who was actually one of the most kind of viciously aggressive Iranian presidents, because after that they started playing the game of having all like the soft faces. Ahmadinejad was never one. He actually was very kind of clear on his intentions. He is one of the champions of the Iranian nuclear program. So knowing all of these things, it just sounds not realistic. Even if Trump, let's say, had this kind of vision of recreating the Venezuela scenario, Ahmadinejad will not be that person. But even that I personally disagree with the assessment completely. Also, some other speculations were saying that this actually might be a deliberately leaked report to discredit Ahmadinejad, to actually make his standing even more difficult. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this. But I also want to point out that we have a clear situation here where the Trump administration is not really beloved by American media, unfortunately, because what happens is that you cannot really rely on media in their reporting about what's happening in Iran, about any Trump administration policy, because literally just because it's a Trump policy, it's going to, you're going to have a lot of disinformation, misinformation, trying to discredit things that a lot of us from the region, we know that these are actually good policies. And it shouldn't be about the, personalized, right? It should be more about the policy rather than the person. So we know that there's a history specifically with the New York Times. Actually, Trump said that he was going to sue the New York Times over their coverage of the war against the Islamic Republic regime that was just happening because of their kind of the coverage that was skewing things. We're not covering the amount of people, of innocent protesters that were killed in the streets of Iran while protesting against the regime. There's a lot of kind of disinformation that we've seen in New York Times and other media as well, unfortunately, about what's happening in terms of the attacks of the regime against Israel, against different Gulf countries. They're saying that those attacks were against military targets. The truth is, most of the attacks were actually against residential areas and hotels. We know that the airports were hit, civilians were killed in Israel and a number of Gulf countries. All of these things were not actually covered by the American media in the way it should have been. And this what makes it even less likely for us to actually take these kind of reports, in my opinion, seriously.
You touched on a few very significant points there, Hayvi. And one is that, now Ahmadinejad has a target on his back, essentially, about this being potentially deliberate. So, why now? Why would this be leaked now? Why do you suppose?
I mean, look, the regime, in my opinion, of course, Shayan, you can jump in on this, but I think that, for people who are observers, even if you would imagine some advisors in the Trump administration, we know that this regime and whoever is left consists of the same core people that were always a part of this ideology and a major proponent of this ideology that is a kind of in its core, it's anti-America, it's anti-West. It wants to have all these ballistic missile nuclear programs with the aim to use them. So I think that, if it is, and we don't even know if this is, deliberate report to begin with. I mean, these are just some of the speculations. All these different names that have been involved in these policies are just, it will be, in my opinion, probably beneficial for the United States and America and Israel for the kind of the internal fighting to continue within the regime, because we know that there's a lot of internal fighting that is starting to happen. You can see the disconnect between some elements within the IRGC that want to hold on to things and continue, and of course, while the some other elements are like, you know what, maybe we're just going to be all wiped out, so let's try to do something about it. Not because they're changed on the inside, not because their ideology is not the same. It's just more of a tactic. Let's try to buy time. Let's try to negotiate, show a softer face. So if these kind of different, disconnects, conflicts that is happening with the regime continues and expands, I don't think that would be a bad thing for the rest of the world, right?
Yeah, and like from the American administration's perspective, I would think that this would cause a lot, like you said, more internal strife between the regime. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, true or not true. But Shayan, from the position of the opposition, because you are in touch with them and you are speaking to them, this has been very demoralizing, hasn't it? Because I've seen the Iran Experts Initiative or the Iran Islamic Republic Influence Network really using this story to delegitimize Netanyahu and Trump.
They are, but to add to what Hayvi was saying, I have to bring this back as well. That leaks in this type and format do not just happen by happenstance. This, I think, is a deliberate attempt in achieving a few goals. Number one, discredit Ahmadinejad internally and also create doubt within the IRGC's leadership and the top echelon that, hey, is this the mole? Is this the guy who's been giving all of our information to the Israelis and to the Americans? Could this be the guy that we didn't know that is running all this behind the scenes attacks on all of our leadership? Could he have given the coordinates about Ali Khamenei's whereabouts? Who knows? Because he's part of the a lot of the upper echelon groupings, so that could be. So here is one layer of doubt added. A second layer is to actually embarrass the Trump administration, because everybody knows there is no love lost between Donald Trump and his administration and the New York Times. So to have this come out that the Trump administration, of all people, was trying to bring Ahmadinejad back to power, it adds another layer of discrediting to Trump and increasing Trump's anger that, hey, I have to combat this. I have to go against this. And I have to beat the Islamic Republic so harsh, so much harsher, so that if their internal groups like IRGC is leaking to their favorite reporters at New York Times, I can beat them. So you see how this was a pretty much deliberate attempt to do that. But the main point remains that Ahmadinejad is a discredited individual. Ahmadinejad does not have a place among the Iranian people, but there is one layer that even the diaspora and the opposition groups were talking about it. And they were saying, as everybody, all of the Iranians are coalescing around the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi about his plan for the transition and all of that, the Western governments and the Israelis thought that they need a ruthless character to come and take care of the surrender period, which means find all the mullahs, bring them to some kind of a court, assess their whereabouts, put them together, and then hand them over to the transition government for, in exchange, a safe passage to a third country for himself. So this is yet another layer that is being bandied about. It has some relevance, but again, they are using a discredited character, and Ahmadinejad must himself be really amused right now.
If we ever hear from him, right?
Exactly.
And just wanted to end with this. I mean, if this was really the plan, why was it never carried out then?
I
Maybe
think
because it was never the plan.
Exactly.
Maybe because it's not a doable plan to even think of the possibility of reattempting Venezuela and Iran. I personally think it's a wishful thinking. And a lot of the analysts in DC who have been working on Iran and who know the regime and know that it's an ideologically radical kind of terrorist promoting and terrorist, practicing regime is just an impossible thing to do. Also, how can you trust somebody that literally just a few days ago was trying to kill as many civilians and Americans and Israelis and just carrying out? I mean, it's really impossible to have even the idea of having a vicious character that could carry on like a transitional period. In my opinion, this is a very dangerous idea. Putting somebody else in charge of the same besiege force, the same IRGC, two terrorist groups to continue on in any direction is just not realistic. A lot of the people here who know about the realities in Iran think that the only way is to actually dismantle different besiege headquarters throughout the country, dismantle both the ballistic missile program and the nuclear program, and then actually start creating a situation on the inside, because as these things happen, the regime will actually start crumbling, which we actually start seeing in the beginning of the strikes, but it stopped after. And Negar, you told me a lot about this too, how people were feeling that when the different checkpoints were being targeted, people had more hopes, there were more defections. And then after, when things shifted in terms of the policy on the strikes, where the strikes started going, which are other things, the more infrastructure, less the actual checkpoints, the actual military apparatus headquarters, then the regime kind of was stabilized once again. But if things do go back into that direction, I think the only way is that the people inside of Iran will actually be more and more and more empowered as this is happening, and we will see the shift happening on the inside. Now, the idea of some boots on the ground, that's another case, another scenario, another conversation.
And I think the reason this didn't materialize because trial balloons usually don't materialize. They're just put out there for a thought process, an engagement, and, mind you, a diversionary tactic. By everybody talking about Ahmadinejad, from the IRGC on down, their attention from all other areas and all other focuses gets shifted. And if you want to have some kind of a process or some kind of a plan or some kind of an attack, then you can operationalize it a lot quicker, a lot faster, and with a lot less engagement from your other side. So it's a perfect game set match to talk about that. Ahmadinejad is yet again delivering for different groups on different levels, but I sincerely do not believe that this was a real plan to bring him to power, but just using his name gives fodder for conversations and to discredit internal.
Well, thank you so much to you both for that fascinating conversation on what appears to be somewhat of a spy thriller now.
Yes.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
So much for having us.
Thank you.
Well, if you liked this episode, you can hit the like button, and we'd love to know what you think, so please leave us a comment. You can also sign up for our dedicated newsletter at iranintl.com/newsletter, and please check out our dedicated English website at iranintl.com/en.